Hello, lovely people. Welcome to Ari Talks About Music. I'm Ari, and today I'll be reviewing the new Wet Leg album, Moisturizer. Moisturizer is the second album from the English indie rock band Wet Leg, who have been quite quiet recently, especially since their release of their self-titled debut album in 2022, which is an album that I have loved pretty much since its release, just for how fun and witty so many of the themes are, both sonically and especially lyrically, which is also quite a common theme on their new project as well. And although this album is not quite as quirky and witty to the same level as their debut, a lot of those moments are instead replaced with them expanding their sound into regions that they've not really explored all that much before, with there being a much more diverse selection of genres and influences on show, as opposed to just the much more basic and straightforward indie rock of their first album. I really do appreciate a lot of the much more post-punk leaning moments as well as the much calmer tracks as well, and I think that those elements as well as pretty much everything else that's on display comes together to create what I think is one of the best put together albums I've heard so far this year. I think that the album couldn't have had a better start with the track CPR, which opens pretty much exactly how you would want a Wet Leg album to open, with a very fun and bouncy drum beat as well as an incredible bass line, which after an incredible intro, it does pretty much just turn into a very standard and somewhat generic indie rock song. However, just with the general wit of Wet Leg's lyrics and their style, it still does manage to remain a relatively good song all the way through. Liquid Eyes, I think, is by far one of the best written songs on the album, opening with this absolutely incredible guitar riff that is just so epic, and does manage to remain very consistent for the whole song. And while this track on the whole is significantly less playful than the style they're typically known for, I still absolutely love the slightly darker tone that this track has, and I think it's just great to see the band expanding their sound in a way that's so wildly different from what they're typically known for, and showing that despite the much more silly and playful stuff is still what they do best, they can still do an incredible job at making a track with a much more serious tone if they want to. As much as I do like the opening guitar riff on Catch These Fists being definitely one of the punchiest moments on the album, it unfortunately doesn't take long to become very repetitive, with there being actually very little to it. And as well, I think that this track is probably the one and only exception to what I was saying earlier about how well put together this album is, with it being quite a harsh transition from the previous track, which is much slower and more serious. And despite this track on the whole still being incredibly well performed, I think overall each section does feel quite disjointed, with each different part of the song not really transitioning that well from one to the next. And it ultimately just feels like each section was kind of written for their own separate songs, but somehow all ended up together. Davina McCall, I think, has an absolutely incredible progression, being mostly, again, quite a mellow song, but the brief moments of being more energetic, I think, are used incredibly well, with them all being quite spaced out, but every single time one happens, it really does feel very meaningful and impactful to the overall sonic progression of the track. I think as well, what really helps to keep the overall vibe of this song so consistent is how even in the more energetic outbursts, the vocals continue to just be incredibly soft like they are on the entire track. Jennifer's Body is nothing short of just a fantastic post-punk song with easily some of my favourite performances on the whole project. I also love the very high-pitched guitar during the chorus that helps the track have this very spacey and airy atmosphere, and especially the vocals on this track that are so passionate and expressive, which I think until this point is something that the album's been lacking in just a little bit. With so many of the tracks while still having perfectly good and competent vocals, I think that enjoying this track as much as I do has definitely highlighted to me that a lot of the vocals on this album definitely do just lack passion just a little bit. Mange Tout is simply a fantastic, straightforward indie rock song, and I do also particularly like the vocal style on this track, with despite it being very comparable to a lot of the other songs, just with how deadpan it is, I really do like the much more witty and blunt tone that the vocals take on. I think that the percussion is also an incredibly well-performed element of this song, managing to remain so consistent but at the same time really fitting whatever sound changes are going on. And even the way that this track ends, I think, is actually quite cool, with it slowly building up to this epic climax, but then just abruptly cutting off in a way that for some reason actually works weirdly well. Han's song is just a really fun and quirky track, with one of the things I found the most instantly likable about it is just the really playful guitar riff during the refrains. And then of course the way the guitar becomes a lot louder during the chorus I think just really helps to give it this very epic kind of feel. Although unfortunately I think that the vocals on this track do drag it down quite a bit, with a much more breathy approach to the vocals, which in this particular song I don't think really matches the style that much. much, just with how much louder and more grand every other element of it is. Although by the end of the track, both the vocals and the instrumentals are working pretty well together, and definitely overall does just feel much more passionate and expressive compared to the vocals on pretty much the entire rest of the song. Pokemon is just for the most part a pretty generic filler track, which I think is quite unfortunate because the chorus on this song is genuinely fantastic and displays a lot of potential, but I think that outside of that, the rest of it just completely lacks the passion and the creativity that the chorus has, with it just being a perfectly inoffensive but still quite generic and boring middle-of-the-road indie rock sound. Pillow Talk is an absolutely fantastic and very explosive song that deals with a much heavier sound than Wet Leg have ever really explored all that much before. It does quite subtly set the tone for this in the intro with a reasonably quiet but still very grungy bass line, but then the chorus is where this song really shows off what it's all about with the much heavier guitars and almost aggressive sounding vocals. But luckily, on the vocal side of things, they definitely don't lack passion, which is for sure. I do, of course, love the incredible contrast on this track with the much more serious and heavy instrumental compared to, again, the very playful and silly lyrics, with this track having quite a lot of sexual themes in the lyrics, which is not something that's popped up all that much on this album compared to how prominent of a theme it was on their debut. I do love the almost shoegaze sounding guitar on Don't Speak, making it one of the most unique songs on the album in that way. And this time, again, takes a much more breathy approach to the vocals, but I think on this one it actually sounds really good. Just again with the much more spacey and almost ethereal feel of the track, especially like I said in how the guitar sounds. I think that this vocal style is just much more suited to that kind of sound. And on the whole, I think that this song really does stick out in the best way possible, being easily one of my favourite tracks just for how unique it is and how well they managed to pull it off. Not only as just a fantastic song on its own, but again just fitting so well with where it is in the album. While I do appreciate 121 for being a much calmer song after the last two tracks, which have been just a little bit intense, I think that it's just a bit unfortunate how this song ends up coming across as boring more than anything, with there being so much repetition and meandering and constantly kind of just using the same ideas over and over again, without ever really exploring anything all that interesting outside of just one or two ideas, which this song does kind of just use to death. But luckily, You and Me at Home is an incredible closing track, with a fun and unique progression, and also going back to the slightly more post-punk sounds, which this album has explored a little bit, and overall a lot of those moments have been definitely some of my favourites. And it really does make me hope that post-punk is a sound that they can explore a lot more in the future, because they're doing a great job at it already. I do also like the very expressive and passionate backing vocals on this track, especially with how they're used in combination with the much more bluntly sung main vocals, especially in the chorus. It does just give it a very sarcastic tone that I think is something that this album has actually done very well. It's just the very consistently well-used satire and sarcasm, just how witty and deadpan a lot of the vocals and lyrics can be at times. And so while this album does still have the odd dull moment that drags it down a bit, and I can't say that I prefer it to their debut, it still shows them exploring so many new sounds and ideas that does give me a lot of hope for the band's future, even if this project as a whole isn't quite up to the standards that they are capable of. And I really hope that in the future, with a bit more refinement, they can take a lot of the ideas, sounds, and influences that they showcased on this album and just turn it into a project that is much more complete and consistent. And so for now, I'm going to give this album a 7 out of 10. Thank you so much for watching this review. Please be sure to listen to this album yourself and tell me your thoughts below. Please leave a like if you liked the video, and please leave a dislike if you didn't like the video. And remember, just stay hydrated.